All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to continue looking at our progressive reformers. And so in our last screencast, I didn't really get a chance to finish, and I kind of left off with the prohibition movement. But I think it's okay because the prohibition movement and the women's rights movement, um, they're similar in a sense that both of them end up becoming big national issues, and they both end up uh, in amendments being passed to the Constitution. And so I think they kind of are linked together in that sense. So we're going to look at first prohibition, and then we'll look at women's rights and kind of how they achieved getting a constitutional amendment passed, which is not the easiest thing to get done. So we're going to start with prohibition. So when you look at prohibition, of course in your head the link that you should be making with prohibition is the temperance movement that we studied in the antebellum period. So again, throughout these I also want you to make the link and make the comparison to the antebellum period. So this is really an extension of the temperance movement that we saw in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. And it's caused by some of the same things. So you do see a heavy hand of religion in the prohibition movement early on. And so they kind of see alcohol as um, causing vices, causing domestic abuse, problems within American society. And so there becomes this popular movement to prohibit alcohol. And you have organizations like the Anti-Saloon League that developed in 1893 to try and get alcohol abolished or prohibited completely. Now that's a difference. In the past, there was a temperance movement to try and limit the consumption of alcohol. This is a prohibition movement to get alcohol prohibited completely, whether it's by state or by the entire nation. Now, depending on where you stood on the issue, you could be considered a wet or you could be considered a dry. So a dry is somebody who wanted to prohibit alcohol, and a wet is somebody who wanted to um, continue to have alcohol consumption as a part of American society. And so these two camps really did divide up Americans. Now, what I think is important about this, just like in the temperance movement, you see a strong uh, link between prohibition and nativism. So often, older generation Americans, Americans who've been here for a longer period of time, they would be more often dries, and immigrants would be much more often wets. And we have to talk a little bit about why that is. In some ways, they use prohibition as kind of an anti-immigrant stance or an anti-immigrant position. Uh, voting against voting against or voting for prohibition didn't necessarily mean you were against alcohol. I know that sounds kind of contradictory, but in some sense it was kind of an attack on the immigrants, an attack on the immigrant culture. Um, and so you do see this division between Americans that the older, more established Americans, or the people who would consider themselves like 100% Americans, kind of use this as a tool to attack immigrants in a sense. Similar to how they used school reform in the antebellum period, or similar to how they used school reform to try and assimilate immigrants into their culture, um, even during this period with the Southern Europeans and the Eastern Europeans. So it does become an immigrant, non-immigrant, kind of an Americanism issue here of prohibition. So that's one way that you get divided up between immigrants and non-immigrants on prohibition. The other division that you see here with prohibition is really urban, rural. So you know that during this time period, America is urbanizing in a substantial way. Cities are growing, big northeastern cities, midwestern cities, industrialization is booming. Um, Now, there's a backlash against that, just like there was a backlash against this in the antebellum period, where rural people kind of see cities as more corrupt, um, you know, a mixing of races, a mixing of immigrant and ethnic groups that they see as bad for moral character and bad for the American character. And so you do see an urban-rural split here with prohibition as well. Urban people are much more likely to be wets than rural people. Rural people are much more likely to be dries. Now, again, it doesn't mean that rural people don't drink alcohol. Um, it's kind of an interesting thing here. It just becomes an issue, a cultural issue of voting for on what they deem to be the right moral perspective for America. In some sense, it's the sense of I don't want those people to drink, meaning immigrants or maybe African Americans, but I want to have the choice to drink myself. So in some ways, it's kind of like a law trying to limit others that maybe even limit themselves. So that makes prohibition kind of an interesting and very ironic uh, issue during the era. Now, eventually, um, the 18th Amendment is passed. And so in 1919, uh, America votes to prohibit alcohol completely within the country, which is a pretty momentous uh, event because if you think about American history and how intertwined alcohol was with early American history, you can think back even to like the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 and different things that happened in American history. It's kind of an interesting development. So prohibition, we're not going to study the effects of prohibition because that's really a big part of the 1920s culture is living under prohibition and kind of how people ignore the law, try to break the law, and skirt the law in any way that they can. But it really is a big change and kind of you see like morals being put into this time a constitutional amendment and prohibition. The 18th Amendment is really the only amendment that eventually gets repealed later on by the 21st Amendment, and so you see it's kind of an experiment, basically about a 14-year experiment in prohibiting alcohol that ultimately fails for the country. But a progressive era reform that is pushed by kind of this moral crusade uh, throughout the country at the time. Now, the other big issue that we're going to take a look at today is the women's rights issue. So again, women's rights, just like prohibition, is able to be pushed into a national amendment. And so what we're going to start with is just a little bit of a review. The two ladies that you're looking at here on the screen, you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And their big contribution first happens at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, and that's where they give the women's rights movement a focus. If you remember, the women's rights movement grew out of the abolition movement of the antebellum period, and what they were able to do here at the Seneca Falls Convention was kind of like streamline what they wanted to achieve in the women's rights movement, which was the right to vote. And gaining the right to vote and women's suffrage became the main issue. Now, they had many stumbling blocks along the way. So when the 15th Amendment was passed in the late 1860s, um, women did not gain the right to vote, and that was something that they saw as a tremendous detriment to their movement. And it kind of made like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton a little bit disgruntled um, at the time. Now they lived pretty long lives into the 1890s, but they're never able to fully achieve and to recognize their goal of gaining women the right to vote. Now, what the organization that they helped to establish, so they helped to establish an organization called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So you can abbreviate it NAWSA or NAWSA. So this organization gets established in 1890, really when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are kind of on their way out. And what the organization decides is that trying to push for a national amendment for women to gain the right to vote it's not working. So they have to try a new approach. And the new approach they try is trying to gain women the right to vote on a state by state basis. And this is much more successful than trying to get a national amendment passed. Now, when you look at what states give women the right to vote, so what I would do here is I would stop, pause the video, and kind of analyze the map here for a second to kind of get an idea of which states give women the right to vote and which states don't, and when do they give them the right to vote, and why do you think that is? So hopefully after you pause the video, you notice that the western states, the New West, give women the right to vote much earlier than the central states or the eastern states. And you have to think to yourself, why is that? Why do the western states basically vote to give women the right to vote earlier? I think it has a lot to do with the nature of the West. It's a newer part of the United States. The eastern states are much more established. Um, the gender roles and the gender boundaries are much more established. There's much bigger cities. So they can afford to kind of keep women in kind of this domestic role. And we talked about the different spheres for women with the cult of domesticity. In the West, they don't really have that luxury. So oftentimes when the people are homesteading in the West and say, states like Montana or Oregon or Wyoming, um, women have to play a much greater role out in the West, and they might have to take care of the farm, and are given much more equal rights and much more social standing with men, and so therefore, uh, in this sense, the Western states are more progressive because women are needed and seen as not as like these dainty creatures who can't do work. They're needed to do work, and so they're given more rights and more protection and given the right to vote earlier than they are in the East. So this, I think, is important. When they change this state-by-state approach, it gives the women's rights movement momentum. And it gives them a sense of like, we're gaining states, and we're gaining people onto our side. So you can make the connection to the more modern issue of gay marriage. If you look at gay marriage, they're not really pushing for a national amendment. They're going state by state, and what's happening is they're winning different states where gay marriage becomes legal, and it's gaining momentum and gaining momentum. And people at this point, feel like it's inevitable. Like they're eventually either going to pass an amendment or they're going to make a national law legalizing gay marriage, or every state is going to kind of turn and make gay marriage legal. The same thing was happening with women's rights. It was gaining momentum by taking this state-by-state approach. And when the Western states all kind of give women the right to vote, it kind of puts pressure on Washington, D.C., and puts pressure on the rest of the country to give women the right to vote. Now, women kind of then try to turn and refocus. So now their state by state is working. Now they're going to try and put pressure on Washington D.C. again to try and get some kind of amendment passed. So a famous parade they have is in 1913, and they march down the Washington Mall, um, huge parade, and they're met with a lot of resistance, some jeers, um, but they kind of are displaying what they want. So this is famous. They carry the ballot because they want the right to vote, and so women are really trying to put some pressure to gain what they see as their full equal rights. Now, what happens um, is you're going to see a big split within the women's rights movement, and two organizations develop. So you first had the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is the one that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton developed. An organization is going to shoot off from that called the National Organization for Women, um, abbreviated NOW, and that's on purpose because they will say they want the vote now. They can't wait anymore. So your leaders of these different movements. Um, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns are going to be the leaders of NOW, and Carrie Catt, who eventually becomes Carrie Chapman, is going to be the leader of the more traditional organization, NAWSA. So you have these two organizations. Now, what splits them is their ideas on how to do this. Um, Carrie Catt thinks that, and that organization, NAWSA, thinks that keeping the same methods that they've been using, kind of applying pressure and protesting, eventually the federal government is going to um, see the light and give women the right to vote. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns feel that you need to take more radical measures in order to gain the right to vote. And so they're willing to take it to another extreme. Now, these two groups, what really divides them is going to be World War I. Carrie Catt and her organization are going to put their full support behind the U.S. troops during World War I, and they kind of put their issue on the back burner. They kind of put women's rights on the back burner, and they pledge their full support to the U.S. military and our war effort. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns kind of do the opposite. So they're going to protest, and these are some famous signs. This is during World War I, them protesting in front of the White House. They kind of compare President Wilson to the Kaiser of Germany. And this is a very famous sign about him denying women the right to vote. And so eventually, what's going to happen